Hi, we're Andy and Lina, two of the Bellroy co-founders, and what have I missed is a question we ask each other often as we explore ideas around business, culture, impact, and personal development. This is a space where we can share some of that exploration. Here's Lina to kick off the episode.
It seems like a pretty standard idea that most companies have in culture language. Like you turn up at the company and it's the sort of the TLA three-letter acronym kind of situation where there's language that people are using, and maybe if it's your first day on the job, you don't know what everyone's talking about. And I think what we're going to talk about today is the thing that is Bellroy's in culture language, the thing that you're going to hear us saying if you turn up to one of our meetings. So, Andy, what's your System 1 read on how this podcast is going to go today?
I think we will bounce around a little. I think we will try and give a vibe of a thing, and then we will try and bring a bit more clarity to understand that vibe a little bit more in a way that makes it a touch more concrete and actionable. If we do our jobs properly.
Sort of from vibe to action.
Yeah.
Yeah.
How about you?
I think this is a really good topic because obviously it stuck with us that it felt very useful for Bellroy to kind of have this concept, and I think we use it a lot. And so I hope that people sort of find it interesting, and I suppose I hope that where we get to at the end is kind of people understand how we're using it and why it's interesting. So I think we can get there, but we'll have to wait and see how it goes.
Sounds fun. We should dive in.
Yeah, so that probably didn't make very much sense though, because we were just sort of using that System 1 language. And the thing we're actually talking about is this concept of different modes of thinking that we would refer to as System 1 and System 2. We first found this idea, I guess, quite a lot of years ago. We didn't look up how long ago Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman was first published, but I think we probably were reading it, I would say 10 or 15 years ago is my vibe. And it was a book that I think really stuck with us as an interesting introduction to how you might be thinking in different modes of thinking, and it sort of spurred that kind of space of exploring thinking for us.
That's right. And I think previously we spoke about art and science a lot, which hopefully by the end you'll understand why that might have flavors of what we're talking about. I think we also fairly early on read The Inner Game of Tennis, which has incredible parallels to this. Self 1 and Self 2, annoyingly the opposite order. However, I think Tim Galway did precede Thinking Fast and Slow on that. That was published in 1970, I think, where I think Danny Kahneman was like early 2000s, perhaps, for this book. However, we're talking about this class, I think, formally, you call it dual process theories of mind, of which Daniel Kahneman's work with Amos Tversky early on was really trying to understand gut feel versus biases. Where does thinking get led astray? Where do you bring more clarity? And it's dealing in this sort of nature of thing that is, what's the difference between a quick gut response and what's the difference between a slow, deliberate, exact, precise style of thinking, like if you're solving a maths problem?
Yeah, and I think this is you've hinted at it with The Inner Game of Tennis contrasted with Thinking Fast and Slow. And I think, are you thinking with your gut or your head? These ideas are ideas that very much exist within society. And I don't think Thinking Fast and Slow invented them. But I think that it was just an articulation that felt quite useful at a particular point. I think what we're not planning on doing today, though, is actually deep diving into explaining those ideas. We feel like there's plenty of places out there that you can go to, whether it be for a quick summary, or you could read the book Thinking Fast and Slow, or you could read it in a game of tennis, or you could do those things. I guess what we wanted to talk about is how we use these ideas, why we think they're interesting. So I'm not sure if that's very helpful to people, that if it doesn't feel like what we're saying fully makes sense, whether you should pause at this point and look up System 1 and System 2 a little bit more, or whether you can sort of go along for the journey with us and perhaps look it up later. But yeah, we're sort of not planning for this to be a discussion about what does System 1 and System 2 mean. Maybe we should just quickly put in a placeholder for someone who read the book 5 years ago and can't quite remember. Like, that might be quite helpful. I don't know. Do you want to have a go at that, Andy?
Yeah, let me try. So depending on which authors you follow, which sort of thought leaders you consume, you might have heard terms like the lizard brain, or you might have heard SNS, sympathetic nervous system. You might have heard gut feel, your intuition. There's a series of thinking modes that have a quick, responsive, probably scraping all sorts of data in an implicit or tacit way that's hard to make it concrete. If someone hits a ball at your face, you're not slowly tracking its trajectory and judging its arc and thinking about gravity's pull and how that will change. You're rushing your hand in front of your face, and it's a very instinctive, almost animalistic response.
In the head with the ball, if you're not very fast, or ducking. For those of us who don't believe we might be able to catch the ball. But yeah.
So there's this one class, Blink was another book really talking about this from Gladwell. These quick responses that you it's not obvious exactly how you came up with that response, but you feel a response, and it might be a physical response, a mental response. It feels intuitive, it feels quick, it doesn't feel labored, it doesn't feel like you have to work hard to come up with an answer. It's there. You either like a person or you don't on first impressions. You either like an outfit or not. You haven't yet pulled apart why. It's a quick response.
And so for me, this feels like one of the ways that I think feels super useful to explain it, or to kind of get the idea out, is something like, imagine you walk into a room and you immediately have a sensation about that room, whether it's that it's dangerous or it's friendly, or like you want to leave immediately. That is all your System 1, not telling you what it is that you saw or the people that were in there, but it's kind of processed a massive information really quickly. So it's the fast thinking, where it's sort of assessed everything, taken it all in, and then said, quick response, walk out the door, or quick response, walk forward, or quick response, you should smile. Whatever it is, it hasn't kind of said to you, here's all the data I've taken in. It's just said, here's my first fast gut quick response to this situation. And I think that feels like a helpful way of thinking about what System 1 thinking is.
It does. And the way I remember that being System 1 is it was the first system. It was the more animal vibe, the more instinctive. Yeah. It was the bit that would have come first in the evolution.
I remember whenever it was 10 or 15 years ago, and I was like, I just can't remember which one's 1 and which one's 2. And I remember you said that to me back then, and that has stayed in my head, that like 1 is the thing that comes first. And so I think it makes sense that it's the fast one, right? It's the thing that comes first, and the thing that came first from an evolution perspective as well. So yeah, that's good.
Absolutely. And then as humans developed, our brains started to change shape. And many people currently talk about our prefrontal cortex as this stage where we can hold, 3 to 5 things, maximum 7 things normally. It's your deliberate, the things you're aware you're thinking, the controlled thought that you are in control of. Some other folks talk about the elephant and the rider. So the elephant being this massive part of background cognitive processing that's going on as your System 1. And then the System 2 is only a small part of what we're able to think of at once. And it takes more, it's the control bit. It feels more effortful for most people. It's the rider where, you think you're in control with this sort of prefrontal cortex, this deliberate thinking, but actually you're massively moved by the elephant beneath you, the System 1. So System 2, you don't have as much attention to use. You're controlling fewer things. If you need to solve a difficult maths problem, if you're trying to get the perfect words in a sentence in an email, if you're trying to plan a difficult event and you're using flowcharts, or you're looking at critical chain or doing something like that, you're probably engaged in system 2 thinking.
And I think the classic thing that everybody will have done one point in their life is make a list of pros and cons for a decision that they need to make. And I think that's a very, very stereotypical system 2 kind of activity, where you get out a piece of paper and you rule a line down the middle and you write cons on one side and pros on the other, and then you write each point down and then you compare them and you like sort of say, well, does this one cancel out that one? And it's slow, right? Like comparing it to system 1, where you walk into the room and you're immediately like, get out of here, this is a terrible situation. And you don't have to like make a list and you don't have to do anything. System 1 just says out. Versus system 2 is really slow. It takes forever. And I also think of it as like spreadsheet work. Anything that has to go into a spreadsheet is system 2. It's sort of like make the columns and get all the data together. So yeah, slow.
Absolutely. And what we find when we look at that is people will generally have a tendency to one or the other, where they feel quite comfortable, and certain cultures will have really leveraged one or the other. So if you think of artistic communities, creative communities, often people are, getting drunk or taken tabs of all sorts of strange drugs and things to try and tap into this inner feeling where they can soak up a zeitgeist and they can have the creativity burst from them. So you see certain communities that really celebrate this, like, what are you feeling? Just express it. And how do you tap into the zeitgeist? And how do you do these things? You see these system 1 led driver communities. And then you also see system 2 communities that might be things like corporate culture, where the TLAs, the 3-letter acronyms, they're all using these very specific words, and they're talking very exactly about things, and they're often analyzing, where they're breaking apart into explicit modules to make exact things that can be communicated and talked about in very accurate ways.
Yeah.
So you tend to find certain cultures and communities and industries even tend to value and hero one mode of thinking over the other.
I think what was interesting here, so hopefully that kind of, as an intro gives everyone some context what we mean when we say system 1 and system 2. And what's interesting as you talk about that there are some communities that really seem to be valuing system 1, like that kind of gut sort of getting the vibe of what's happening, and some who really seem to value system 2. I think, the spreadsheet work. I think that when we read this book, it was very much within the context of us like trying to soak up the knowledge of the world as we were embarking on creating a business. It felt like before I started it, the answer was going to be that this was a book that helped you do system 2 thinking better and like shut system 1 up and like get it out of the room so that you could do system 2. And that's not what the book is about, and it's not what the concept is about. And I think what is super interesting, if we sort of kind of start weaving Bellroy into the story a little bit more, what I notice is that whenever we introduce this concept to anyone at work, and it, not everyone, so like it doesn't need to be everyone has this response, but I think the natural work context response to sort of thinking fast and thinking slow, or system 1, system 2, is that system 2 is the thing that we're trying to teach people to use, and that it wouldn't be appropriate to use system 1 in the workplace, and that system 1 sort of is the thing that is like where your emotions live, or where your irrationality potentially lives, or that there's less control there. And so often I find, as we're talking about the concept, after we've gotten past, hey, here's a really cool idea of know what system 1 and system 2 is, I think the conversation that happens is actually now what we want to do is use both. And that feels like the thing we're trying to sort of convince on. But maybe before we sort of dive right into that, maybe it would be interesting for us to explore, like, what do we see out in the world sort of beyond artist communities and businesses? Like, I think we were chatting about this before, and I think what you were saying about Steve Jobs having the magic of really valuing System 1 ideas and what he brought to Apple really transformed it away from Dell and to Apple.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think when we spoke about certain communities kind of heroing or focusing more on one mode or the other, the great achievements are almost always when you get the two modes working in synergy and you understand the strengths and weaknesses of each, and you understand how much more effective and compelling you can be in the world if you have access to both, and if both are in a strong, rich relationship that talk to each other.
Yeah.
And Steve Jobs seemed to be, from the things we've read about him, someone that had really spent a lot of time understanding how to go into System 1, into these rich, complex, interconnected models that the background thinking of his brain was generating, and understanding them and heeding them. And Apple would talk about not doing so many focus groups, like just having a sense of how to shape a vision of the future. Apparently at university, Steve Jobs went and studied a lot of meditation techniques and ancient wisdom techniques that would give him a richer access to that deep sort of tacit or implicit knowledge pool that's bubbling along in the background.
Yeah, the vision that I kind of get is, it's interesting. I think Steve Jobs often had this sort of aura of being slightly angry about things not being right. I don't know, that's maybe a very friendly, diplomatic way of describing some of the things that people say about him. But my sense is that what he was doing is using System 1 to really grok what the customer would think of a thing that Apple did, and that when he was cross about what was going on within the company, it felt to me like that was very much him channeling a System 1 response to how would a customer feel if they saw that on their product, if they opened their phone and saw that color of yellow. It's like, well, that's going to blah, 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 do all of these things. And I felt like that sense that I got as people, as we hear stories about him being described, was that it was very much he was thinking about the customer perspective really strongly in that way. And then I think it's interesting because I also think that Apple feels like this behemoth of System 2 organization, right? So what you get is Steve Jobs as a leader sort of channeling customer expectations and responses, but then I think successfully sending that information from System 1 to his System 2 to employ Johnny Ives to design the product right, and to employ Tim Cook to set up the systems that means the product will get there. And you can sort of see how he's such an embodiment of what it looks like when System 1 and System 2 are working together.
I think that's spot on. And if we want an example of someone that is even more in tune with System 1, I think Rick Rubin's a great example, the music producer. For those that don't know, his, many of the albums that you've loved from vastly different genres.
He's had his hand on them.
He's had his hand on them. And when you hear Rick Rubin talk about the creative process, he deeply embodies a System 1 feel. Like he almost looks like he's levitating, and he has this wild beard and walks around barefoot and his feet are in the grass, and he talks about listening to the universe, and he encourages artists to get their sort of System 2 very deliberate more judgmental mind out of the way to let this flow happen. And so I think we can find people who embody one system even more than Steve Jobs. But I think you're right. What Steve Jobs did well was he seemed to dance between the two systems and have a strong relationship that meant they weren't fighting each other. His System 1 and System 2 weren't fighting. They weren't at battle.
They were like friends,
They were
right?
friends.
Yeah, they totally hung out together.
Or at least that's how, when we read about him, the stories, those sorts of things, that's how it seems to come across.
It's the thing we try to emulate, right? It's difficult, I think, for any product business. I don't know, I believe it should be difficult for any product business in the world today to not at least look at Apple and try and understand what's going on there. I think you can choose you don't like it or you can choose you love it, but I think you have to look at it and try and understand. And so I guess what we're doing is trying to understand what we see emerging from a company like Apple with a theory like System 1 and 2 to help us work out what is going on there that we could bring into our culture that would allow us to have some of the similar positive impacts within what we're doing.
Absolutely. And so if we're saying someone like Rick Rubin might embody System 1 vibes well, System 2 vibes might be Spock? Or
whoa, I was like,
who
are you going to say? System 2. Oh, that's really tricky. Because I think the problem, so here's the problem with the question, right, is that everyone I think of feels cartoonishly, well, I guess you said it with Spock. So like what I wanted to do was find someone actually respectable who led with System 2. Probably Michael Dell is an interesting example. Like I remember this is the subtitled talking about the computer companies born in, flourishing in the 90s. But, I think Michael Dell was someone who it felt like that company was really a little bit less connected with how a person might be socially inspired by their particular computer, but it was very much inspiring you on how it worked and what was the system and how did it all get assembled together and what did the factory look like. And I remember being a little bit fascinated by Dell as it was sort of emerging. And I think that kind of thinking is probably a really good example of a not Gordon Gekko style Spock
That's a
style
great call.
too.
Don't take the silly caricature. Take someone actually living and acting in that way. And with Dell, you could configure with every combination and permutation. You could do it. It felt a very logical.
Yeah.
It felt a very concrete way of engaging and understanding the value proposition. And
like
exactly
at that time, computers were like a little bit funky. They were sort of a little bit not quite a complete product. And so thinking about computers that way, it probably felt really useful as you were trying to imagine buying one and you had to like choose your RAM and remember all the choices you had to make. And so I think what Dell was doing was sort of really System 2ing. It was just like a website full of choices and decisions and comparisons. And that felt probably quite useful for where that particular product was at the time.
Absolutely. So where my mind's going at the moment is, could we start to talk about some examples of what that relationship between System 1 and System 2 looks like when it's working properly? Mm-hmm. When do you start with System 1? When do you finish with System 2? How we do that? And so maybe there's some examples that would give a sense of how a meeting might run or how a product might be critiqued or something that would give a sense of that relationship when
Definitely.
It's working well.
So I think I think this, like, it should be fair to say this happens every day for us. And while, whatever example we give, it's not like we've picked one example from 3 years ago that we kind of retell the story and over. But so, at the moment we're contemplating working with a new customer. They have their own their own set of needs, and we need to work out how do we fulfill their requirements. And it's a little complicated, and we're not sure if we're going to kind of get it right and if it's going to work. And there were a few of us in a meeting, and I said to our chief production officer, well, actually, I think maybe there were a few of us there, but I said to the group, what's your System 1 read on whether we're going to end up with this customer on board or not? And he said, my System 1 is we're not going to, because we're not going to know how to cope with the risks that are inherent in actually working with this particular customer. And so we're going to say no, and we're going to lose the customer. But, so I think I've already done a little bit of system 2 there. Basically, I said, what's your system 1 read? Are we going to end up with this customer? And he said, no. And it's like, damn, that's like, I would really like us to have this particular customer. And Aria's just said no. So that's, I think, an example of a really interesting starting point where a group of us are sitting around talking about a project, and we're sort of talking a bit and we're not resolving where we're at, and asking that system 1 question. What's your system 1 here? Are we going to make this work? And they say no. It's such a powerful starting point, because then what I would do is be like, okay, my system 1 has heard you, but now I'm going to use my system 2 to ask you a series of questions to try and work out what was in his system 1 that meant it produced that no answer. And so then I would be like, and I mean, this is, how we played out this particular example, where I sort of said, well, tell me what goes wrong. What's the problem? And he said, I don't think we can handle the risk. We're too risk averse to be able to fulfill some of this potential customers' requirements. And it's like, okay, risk averse. So that's interesting. That probably means that if we're going to succeed with this particular customer, what we need to do is de-risk the project a little bit. And it's like, okay, well, what if we made slightly less contribution margin on this particular customer, but the variability of the risks that we were sort of looking at were less? And in the end, we changed our strategy. We sort of said, okay, without going to sort of into all of the details, we decided we'd take a different approach to how we pitched the customer. We ended up pitching a combination of sea freight and air freight. We ended up being a little bit more conservative in what our supply lines would be, so that we probably were going to spend a little bit more money servicing the customer. We were probably going to forego a little bit of revenue early on, but the risk was going to be much more reduced. And it turned out that the way we sort of went back to the customer, within 2 weeks, they'd come back to us and said, yes, we want to work with you. And I feel like it was that thinking process that allowed us to find the strategy we were going to use that meant we could go back to the customer confidently.
And I think that's spot on, because if you tried to do it all in system 2, there would have been these niggles, these sort of unsettling feelings in Aria and potentially others in the room where it wasn't properly addressed. And if you'd only gone system 1,
we couldn't have found solutions.
Yeah, you would have said no to the opportunity.
Yeah.
And by having the dance between, we're going into that system 1, let you kind of unearth something. A friend used to talk about any difficult decision. He'd flip a coin and then feel whether he was happy with the outcome of that coin flip.
Yes.
And that was just a way to sort of bypass and go straight to system 1 for him.
Yeah.
But that thing of being able to dance between meant you could actually almost transcend the existing set of factors in that decision, identify which ones were having an oversized response, and then actually kind of target how to address that.
Yeah, and my sense is that what it looks like for us day to day is we very rarely need to say, what's your system 2 response to this? Because actually I think in a work context, in the culture of the world that we live in, people bring their system 2s to work a lot, but they don't bring system 1. And so I feel like at Bellroy, what we're regularly doing is saying, what's your system 1 response to this? Or actually there's a counter where I feel like if we're in a meeting and somebody wants to share some feedback, I feel like the other thing that regularly happens in conversation is someone will say, my system 1 response is I don't like it. And I actually don't quite know why, but I'm just going to call that out. And I think that is almost a request for the room to help out and say, okay, could you, I'm sitting here and I'm feeling like I want to walk out the door. I think this is a bad idea and I can't work out why, but I'm kind of respect you all enough that I want to tell you that. And when you have the language of saying it's a system 1 response, you're kind of saying, I don't know why I feel this way, but my brain's kind of processed all the data and has said no. And then I think what happens is the rest of the room totally understands what this is my system 1 response means, and jumps in and says, okay, is it that you don't like how long this is going to take to release? And then you're like, no, that's not it. And then someone else will say, all right, is the issue maybe that we're doing it in too many colors? And I feel like often we sort of iterate on a bunch of questions, and then eventually someone will ask the question and the other person will say, actually, that's kind of close to the thing that I'm worried about. And it feels like it's a really useful way for someone to object to an idea without feeling like they're kind of shutting something down or being unfriendly. It's a way to kind of really honestly say, I'm here for this from an analysis perspective, and I think there's something that we haven't handled yet.
I think that's really accurate. I think in talking about System 1 and System 2, I do want to start talking about the strengths and weaknesses just quickly on those. Mm-hmm. So Daniel Kahneman was very famous for this dual process theory of mind, but he and Amos Tversky were also very famous for talking about biases and what are those unconscious or subconscious biases that just can distort things. And so if your System 1 is being informed by weird, hazy feedback loops, or if it doesn't really have the right grasp, but this problem looks a bit like this other problem that's adjacent, and so it's skewing towards treating it as the same class of thing when it might not be. There's a series of things there. So we can't talk too much longer, but I do think it's worth saying that there is a series of ways that System 1 can help a lot, but it is fallible.
It can make mistakes.
Yeah. Especially if the type of thing looks a bit like something else, or if it doesn't have the right inputs.
Well, because it's fast, right? And it's kind of designed to tell you that you should run away right now, because there's actually that thing that's moving in the bushes over there, that's a tiger, and it's going to come and eat you. And in that context, it's quite fine if it's wrong some of the time, right? It's better to err on the side of caution and tell you to run. But we sort of don't have tigers chasing us now. And so that fast, quick first response can go a little bit haywire if it's not properly checked.
Absolutely. And we are no longer in the same evolutionary environment that our mental hardware sort of came to age in.
Yeah.
And many things we do now look a bit different. We've heard many of the issues with social media, and there's so many tricks it's doing to keep us engaged or keep us scrolling and doing those things. That's trying to sort of bypass System 2 and get your System 1 just addicted to something, engaged in it by using a series of tricks. There's many examples where System 1 can lead us astray, and this is... But also, when it's only System 2, you're missing out on the supercomputer. You're missing out on this phenomenal sort of mental bandwidth that can happen in the background and process so many things so quickly. So this is the dance. This is learning the relationship. It's learning which elements are great and learning a blended mode of thinking that toggles between them and uses a yin and yang.
And so maybe for us at Bellroy, we opened today by sort of talking about the fact that if there was one piece of jargon that I think you'll find in Bellroy, it's probably, there's probably more, but I think System 1 and System 2 are, you might not get through your first day without somebody referring to them. And I think that how to think about problems and not be biased is probably one of the biggest challenges. And so I can see why it serves us really well to make this concept explicit and create an affordance for people to call out explicitly when they think their System 1 is doing something funny to them, rather than sort of having you be sitting in the meeting stewing in the corner because you're not quite happy with the decision and you don't quite know how to navigate how you're feeling.
It's so true. It almost removes you enough that there's more agency and less being embedded in ego. It's sort of permission to separate and say, oh, this isn't me, this is my system one.
It is, yes. Totally. It is totally like system one gets to be this other little mini character and not the complete you, and you can sort of look at it from a third person perspective.
Awesome. I think that probably gives a sense of how we're doing it. I think we can definitely share some links for interesting angles and other ways to explore this topic.
Totally. So I think for us, we wanted to have system 1 and 2 sort of be represented, I guess, for our team and for anyone who finds it useful more broadly, from the perspective of where we find it interesting. And I think a lot of people at Bellroy will probably be recommended to read Thinking Fast and Slow as one of the first books when they join. And I guess this podcast sort of works as a nice pair up next to reading System 1 and reading Thinking Fast and Slow. So you sort of get a sense of why we like it and how we use it. I think that we really wanted to acknowledge that we think that Thinking Fast and Slow has done a great job of bringing a version of the idea out into the world, but in fact, this is an idea that has existed for all of time, really, and has been represented in many different ways. And so we might talk about the inner game of tennis another day, but it's a different example of a similar gut versus head thinking dichotomy that we think is quite useful. And it's something that we use every day and that we find super helpful.
Awesome.
Have we missed anything important? Yes.
Yes, there's so much. This really is just sort of the intro to how we wrestle, and there's so many great ways that this then expresses in other areas, and there's more precise models we can use in other areas. However, hopefully there's just enough of the vibe of the thing.
Hopefully that's enough for today.
Job.
Excellent.
Thanks for joining us for today's conversation. You can find details and relevant links in the show notes. If you feel like you're learning something here, perhaps subscribe on either Spotify or Apple. And if you have the chance, leave a review and let us know how we're going. Bye for now.